Close your eyes, unless of course you're driving, and imagine standing in the middle of a bustling Parisian café in 1913, listening to the hum of progress and the promise of a new century, only to have that entire world vanish in a cloud of mustard gas just a few months later. In our last episode, we looked at the powder keg of 19th century nationalism and imperialism. Today, we're watching that powder keg explode into the most violent century in human history. We are tackling Unit 8, 20th Century Global Conflicts for AP European History. Although, if you're listening from a different perspective, stick with us. It's all the same history. Now, this unit covers the era of total war, the rise of brutal dictators, the Russian Revolution, the shifting of the global balance of power from Europe to the superpowers of the Cold War. Now, this unit represents 10 to 15% of your AP exam. So let's get into that evidence that you need to nail those essays. Now, as a reminder, before we get underway, the AP exam, as many of you already know, is now less than 2 months away. And if you're feeling the pressure, check out my self-paced skills courses on OutSchool to sharpen your DBQ or your LEQ strategies. Send me questions that you have by emailing me at wendy@aphistoryhelp.com. Leave a message through my website. I might even include pertinent questions on the review episode, which will be live streamed in advance on Sunday, April 26th on TikTok. And it will be released as a podcast episode on Monday, April 27th, in advance of the AP exams. I can't believe how close we are getting to the end of the school year. So we better get started. We got a lot to cover. Come on in, students, and take your seats. I'm Wendy, and this is the AP History Help podcast. In Unit 7, we saw the buildup of nationalism and imperialism, and in Unit 8, we see the consequences. We are talking about World War I, the Russian Revolution, the Great Depression, and the horrors of World War II. World War I wasn't just a war. It was the first total war. This means every resource and every citizen was mobilized for the effort. For the cause, remember the main acronym. I think every teacher who teaches World War I is teaching the main causes: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. But also, don't forget about the A. Some teachers teach mania. The other A, is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. That's the spark. I like to think of it as a stovetop with 4 pots of water simmering. The nationalism that began in Europe in the 1800s, plus the Franco-Prussian rivalry, along with the competition of imperialism that led to the forming of alliances. And of course, the need for alliances is the building up of the military. That's just keeping those pots of water at a simmer. But it was at that place that when the assassination happened, it was the equivalent of turning those burners up to high, and with everything now boiling over, we have World War I. Imperial relationships pulled, quote unquote, everyone in. This is the era of trench warfare and the shattering of the 19th century psyche. New technologies like poison gas, tanks, airplanes, they all turned the battlefield into a mechanical slaughterhouse. Now, the Treaty of Versailles ended the war, but it planted seeds for the next one. By blaming Germany entirely based on the war guilt clause and demanding massive reparations, the Allies created an environment where extremism could grow. While the rest of Europe was fighting in the trenches, Russia was collapsing from within. In 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the provisional government in Russia. And they promised peace, land, and bread, and they delivered a radical new communist state. For the exam, know that the Russian Revolution was the direct result of the stresses of World War I and the long-standing failures of the Tsarist regime. This might be a small thing, but the word Tsar can be spelled C-Z-A-R or T-S-A-R. It's the same word. Either way, it means king in Russian. And Tsar Nicholas II was largely to blame for his ineffective leadership during the war. And he ended up abdicating to the provisional government, making it easy for Lenin to overthrow them. By the way, Lenin was helped by the German government, who benefited greatly from Russia exiting the war. Oh, and when Russia left, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. So when World War I ended, Russia wasn't invited to the meetings at Versailles because they were like, you already signed a treaty to end your beef with Russia or with Germany. So that was a whole nother thing. But it's time for our fun fact, because I can't talk about the Russian Revolution without talking about this. No discussion on the Russian Revolution is complete without mentioning the bizarre influence of a very strange man by the name of Grigory Rasputin. Now, if you've ever wondered how a Siberian peasant ended up in the inner sanctum of the Romanovs, the royal family, it comes down to a medical mystery and a mother's desperation. The Tsar's only son, Alexei, suffered from hemophilia, which was still is a condition where the blood does not clot properly. In the early 1900s, this was a death sentence. Every time the boy bumped a knee, he faced internal bleeding and agonizing pain. Enter Rasputin. He appeared to be the only person who could stop the boy's bleeding, possibly through hypnosis or simply by telling the doctors to stop giving the boy aspirin, which unbeknownst to them at the time is a blood thinner. Now, while Rasputin's magical healing is a great story, the AP Euro application is actually about political legitimacy. While Tsar Nicholas II was away at the front lines during World War I, Rasputin's influence over the Tsar's wife, Alexandra, became so total that he was essentially helping to fire and hire government ministers. Now, the Russian public didn't know about Alexei's illness. To them, it just looks like this creepy monk is living with the Tsarina while the Tsar is away, and he had hijacked the government, which fueled the fire of the February Revolution. Now, the nobles in Russia hated Rasputin because not only was he a threat to the Tsar, but he was allegedly having clandestine relationships with their wives. So they plotted his demise. Now, Rasputin's death is the stuff of legends. He survived poisoning, multiple gunshots before he finally fell into an icy river and drowned only because he was stuck under ice. But his real legacy was the final collapse of the Romanov dynasty. Now, if you're writing an essay on the causes of the Russian Revolution, you could use Rasputin as evidence for internal instability and corruption of the Tsarist regime. Rasputin was the physical embodiment of why the Russian people lost faith in their leaders. Now, the first revolution, the February Revolution of 1917, was a spontaneous explosion of anger. Women in Petrograd marched for bread, the army mutinied and joined them, and Nicholas II was forced to abdicate because of it. It wasn't planned, it was a societal breaking point. After the Tsar, a moderate liberal provisional government took over, and their biggest mistake, they decided to stay in World War I. This decision opened the door for Vladimir Lenin and his radical Marxist group, the Bolsheviks. Lenin arrived from exile with a simple 3-word promise that resonated with everyone: peace, land, and bread. He recognized that you can't have a liberal democracy in a country with a 90% illiterate peasantry. You needed a radical, disciplined vanguard party. So the October Revolution of 1917 was a highly planned coup. The Bolsheviks seized power, immediately exited the war with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and began to nationalize the land. To win the ensuing Russian Civil War, the Bolsheviks used war communism. This was a brutal but effective policy of nationalizing all industry and ruthlessly requisitioning grain from the peasants to feed the Red Army. They won the war, but they destroyed the economy. Lenin realized that this was unsustainable, and in 1921 he introduced the new economic policy, the NEP. This was a tactical retreat from communism, allowing for a temporary mixed economy where small private businesses could operate. For the exam, the NEP is vital evidence for continuity and change. It was a brief moment of capitalist pragmatism that saved the new state from total collapse. Now, when Lenin died in 1924, a power struggle began. People assumed that Leon Trotsky, the brilliant intellectual leader of the Red Army, would take over. But they underestimated Joseph Stalin, who was the secretary or the general secretary of the Communist Party, the ultimate bureaucrat. He spent years quietly placing his loyal supporters in key positions. While Trotsky was an internationalist focused on world revolution, Stalin promoted socialism in one country, arguing that they must make the Soviet Union strong first. Stalin used the 1-2 punch of political maneuvering and ideological focus to push Trotsky into exile and eventually seize total control. Under Stalin, the NEP was gone. In its place, he launched the 5-year plan, a series of 5-year plans. This was a rapid, brutal, state-directed push to industrialize the Soviet Union. Stalin knew they were decades behind the West, but he believed they had 10 years to catch up or be crushed. The 5-year plans had 2 pillars. First was collectivization. Stalin forced all private farms into massive state-run collective farms, and the goal was to feed city workers and export grain to fund heavy industry. The second was the liquidation of the kulaks. Kulaks were better off peasants who had thrived under the NEP and who had resisted collectivization. Stalin saw them as an ideological threat and ordered them eliminated as a class. Millions were executed or deported to the gulags, a vast system of forced labor camps. Collectivization caused the single worst man-made catastrophe in European history, the Holodomor from 1932 to 33. This was a state-engineered famine in Ukraine that killed up to 7 million people. In your DBQ or LEQ on causation or consequence, use Holodomor as evidence for the devastating human cost of totalitarian control. How did Stalin maintain this? With the Great Purge of the 1930s, he used the secret police to systematically eliminate any perceived rival, from old Bolshevik heroes to military generals to ordinary citizens. Nobody was safe, and everyone was terrified. By 1939, Stalin had turned the Soviet Union into a centralized industrial totalitarian powerhouse, but at the cost of tens of millions of lives. Remember that Unit 8 is a study in causation and totalitarianism, and Stalin didn't build a communist utopia. He built a state of terror. All right, so I got ahead of myself there, and I spent probably a little bit too much time talking about the Russian Revolution, but I feel like it gets underserved between the world wars, so I wanted to give it a little bit of extra time. So back to the rest of Europe after World War I. So after 1918, Europe tried to return to normalcy, but the Great Depression made that impossible. When the U.S. stock market crashed in 1929, it pulled the global economy down with it. But Germany was in especially bad times due to the war reparations that they were expected to pay to France, Britain, and the U.S. They tried printing more money, which devalued their currency. And then they didn't even try to pay their debts. In Europe, this led to massive unemployment and the rise of fascism. Patriotism is pride in your country. Nationalism is putting your country first. And fascism is country over all else, including the people in it. There's a great educational documentary video from Rick Steves about fascism, where this part really sticks with me. He says that fascists offer easy solutions to difficult problems. In Italy, Mussolini promised order. In Germany, Adolf Hitler promised a return to national glory. And both used propaganda, nationalistic rhetoric, and state-sponsored terror to seize control. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history, characterized by even more extreme mobilization than the first. It was the logical, terrifying conclusion to the tensions of the 1930s. It was a war of ideologies fought on a truly global scale. Nations like Germany and the Soviet Union utilized every aspect of their society for the war effort, leading to massive civilian casualties through strategic bombings and land invasions. The intersection of industrial technology and ideological warfare in World War II didn't just change how battles were fought. It fundamentally rewired the 20th century by erasing the line between soldier and civilian. World War II was the ultimate total war where the machine of progress that we discussed back in Unit 7 was fully weaponized through innovations like radar and jet engines and atomic energy to maximize destruction. These technological leaps facilitated the Holocaust, a state-sponsored industrialization of death that used modern logistics and chemistry to carry out genocide on an unprecedented scale. Beyond the battlefield of this technological surge was the transformation of wartime inventions into the backbone of the modern world. The same rocketry used for the V2 paved the way for the space race, while early computing designed for code breaking sparked the digital revolution. This era saw the most horrific consequence of racial nationalism, the Holocaust. The Nazi regime systematically murdered 6 million Jews and about 6 million others in a state-sponsored industrialization of death. To really earn that complexity point, you have to talk about how the first half of the 20th century was a total assault on certainty. For 200 years, the Enlightenment taught us that the world was a rational, predictable place. But the horrors of the total war, combined with the massive scientific revolution, second wave of scientific revolution, shattered that security blanket forever. You see, while soldiers were fighting in the trenches, scientists were blowing up the very idea of a fixed reality. Albert Einstein proved that time and space are not absolute. They're relative to the observer. While Niels Bohr and Erwin Schrödinger introduced us to the bizarre world of quantum mechanics, where probability replaced predictability. Werner Heisenberg took it even further with his uncertainty principle, arguing that at a subatomic level, you literally cannot know everything. An idea that reflected the chaotic, unpredictable nature of a Europe torn apart by a global conflict. While the physicists were unsettling the physical universe, Sigmund Freud was unsettling the human mind. He argued that we aren't the rational masters of our own house, but are driven by dark, irrational, subconscious urges, known as the id, a theory that seemed terrifyingly confirmed by the senseless slaughter of millions in the Great War. This crisis of the mind reached its peak when Enrico Fermi and others turned the theoretical physics of Bohr and Einstein into the very real, very terrifying power of the atomic bomb, proving that human progress had finally outpaced human morality. For your exam, connect this age of uncertainty to the rise of extremist politics, when people feel like nothing, not even space, time, or their own minds, is stable. They are far more likely to reach for strong leaders who promise absolute total order. or easy solutions to difficult problems. By 1945, the European age of empire was over. The continent was physically and economically destroyed, leading to the Cold War era, where the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the new global arbiters. Next episode, releasing on March 30th, I'm going to do a writer's workshop. This is always challenging to do as an audio podcast because as a teacher, I want you to see the documents and I want to be able to mark them up, highlight them, circle things. But this will be about sourcing them and how you can approach this DBQ point in a relatively systematic way. Be sure to look or listen for it in a couple of weeks. If you subscribe to the podcast, you'll get notified when it comes out. And send me your feedback. I'd like to know what you think about it and if I'm leaving anything out or leaving you wanting more. That is going to do it for this episode, boys and girls. We are getting close. So keep reviewing, keep practicing, and remember, you've got this. And with that, this episode of the AP History Help podcast is now history.